Hello everyone, this is my new program, Gentlemen's, and my guest today is real gentleman, Scott Ritter. Mr. Ritter, we appreciate your work and very grateful. A huge number of people in Russia are grateful to you, your work, and waiting for you in your book tour of Russia. Thank you so much. Today I have 7 questions for you, and my first question is related to the issuance of the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin of International Criminal Court. In my opinion, this is another proof that the collective West absolutely does not want to negotiate. And secondly, this is another spit in the face of all Russians. We in Russia do not hate the West, but when we look at such decision, we think that the level of their stupidity is unreal. It's impossible to understand. They want to insult us. What do you think about this? What is the point of this decision?
Well, what we know is that the decision is not about the rule of law. It's a decision about political motivations. Is that this decision is coming on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the greatest war crime committed this century, which is the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. And the perpetrators of this crime, both George W. Bush, Tony Blair, but to some extent, Bill Clinton, who helped set up this invasion, and Barack Obama, who continued it. So 4 of the world's greatest war criminals continue to travel the world freely, be wined and dined and feted, and no warrant has ever been issued for their arrest. The one time when the International Criminal Court did seek to bring justice to America is when it threatened to issue warrants or to investigate war crimes perpetrated by American soldiers in Afghanistan. At that time, the United States basically threatened to arrest every single one of the justices on the ICC and bring them to American justice, and immediately those threats went away. So we know that the International Criminal Court is not a court of law. We know it is not a court of justice. What it is a compliant tool of the rules-based international order to, and I won't use the word prosecute, to persecute those whom the West finds inconvenient. Now, to date, they've been able to go after African warlords. They've been able to go after Bosnian and Serbian defeated generals and presidents, but they've never taken on something of this magnitude. First of all, we have to understand that just on the face of it, this warrant has no validity under the rule of law. Not only is Russia not a party to the ICC, but you can't indict a head of state. I mean, that's just sort of like rule number 1. I have a fantasy, which is I'd love to see Mr. Khan, the prosecutor, try to serve this warrant on Vladimir Putin. I fantasize about this. I dream of that moment because it would just be a sight to see. It would just be glorious the way that Mr. Khan's life was terminated instantly by Vladimir Putin's bodyguards. And I would also like to see what would happen to the ICC facilities in The Hague should they go forward to this, because I think the Kinzhal missiles would make quite the explosion in these facilities. They don't understand that you don't get to play games with world powers and world leaders. This isn't about justice. Vladimir Putin committed no crime. What is he being accused of? When you have a Ukrainian leader, Petro Poroshenko, stand there and announce to the world that he will shell the Donbass and compel the children of the Donbass to cower in basements. And then Vladimir Putin sends in the Russian army and they free these children and they take these children out of harm's way. And this makes him a criminal. They accused him of kidnapping. What kind of kidnapper holds the children in safety only to turn them over to the parents when the parents show up and say, we want our children. Thank you for taking them, but we're now ready to have our children back. And they freely turned the children over. No crime was committed, none whatsoever. And a humanitarian act was undertaken by the Russian Federation at the behest of the Russian leadership. That's what happened. But the world can't say that. You see, to say that would have to recognize that Russia is a force for good. That's not the narrative that exists in the West. Russia, of course, must be painted as a force of evil. Now, who is holding this paintbrush? A Ukrainian regime as vile and odious as one that has ever existed in Europe in the last century. A regime that has bought into the hateful ideology of Stepan Bandera, that has allowed the Nazi ideology of Adolf Hitler to once again rear its ugly head in Central Europe. A regime that is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, the displacements of tens of millions, and the destruction of over $1 trillion worth of infrastructure. This is all on the Ukrainian regime. Now, maybe they can say, well, we were pushed into this conflict, but pushed by whom? By Russia? No. Russia is the only party that has sought peace throughout by pursuing the Minsk Accords, by seeking a negotiated European security framework settlement in December of 2021. And then once the war started, to seek the earliest possible resolution through a negotiated settlement. It wasn't Russia that walked away from the Istanbul tables on 1 April of last year. It was Ukraine at the behest of NATO, their NATO masters, who got Ukraine into this conflict. And it's these same NATO masters working with Ukraine who have pushed the ICC to carry out this feckless, vile task of issuing a warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin and his and the Russian individual who was responsible for the safeguarding of these Ukrainian children. Look, history will judge, and it won't judge Russia harshly. Russia will emerge. Russia is on the right side of history. But it's hard to tell people to have patience when every day they have to face this attack, these baseless attacks, these vile attacks at the hands of people they had once viewed as friends, and I think continue to hope that one day they will be friends again. But how can you be friends with people who treat you this way? It's a fair question, but I am disgusted by what has happened here, especially, again, on the 20th anniversary of the greatest war crime committed this century, which is the invasion of Iraq. And that George W. Bush and his entire administration continue to be treated as legitimate leaders, as people deserving respect. They belong in jail.
Absolutely. My next question is also about the president, but now only of China. Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow. You have talked a lot about the Chinese peace plan, but to be honest, many Russians are not ready to accept it. We have already suffered too many victims, and many people are not ready to recognize this as a victory. They want both Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, Kharkov to be part of Russia. A change of Zelensky regime. This is hope that, on the contrary, Xi Jinping will come to provide more assistance to Russia. Not artillery, but maybe other materials or components of weapons. Moreover, there are reports that sources this time huge Russian cargo planes An-124 often fly to China and bring something from there. And the US has often talked about this and even imposed sanctions against individual Chinese companies. What do you expect from the arrival of the Chinese president in Moscow?
Well, first of all, this is a momentous occasion. You have the newly appointed or elected Chinese president, an unprecedented third term, consecutive term, choosing as his first foreign travel as head of state to go to Moscow. It sends a clear signal as to where China's loyalties and friendship are. And they're with Russia, they're with Moscow, they're with Vladimir Putin. So China's not arriving here. Xi Jinping's not arriving as an enemy or even as a furtive friend. He is a real friend, a true friend. So no matter what transpires, it is going to be transpiring in an atmosphere of friendship, meaning China is looking on how it can best support Russia in these difficult times, and to solidify a continued constructive relationship based upon friendship, not alliance, with Russia going forward. Now, you've spoken of the peace plan. Let's be frank, that's the business of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and then their respective parliamentary bodies. Whether I speculate this way or you speculate that way, it doesn't matter. People have asked me questions, and I have to go based upon the data that is available. What do we know? We know that China is a nation that has bought into a notion of Westphalian principles dating to the Treaty of Westphalia that speak of respect for sovereignty and the integrity of national boundaries. And that these Westphalian principles have been challenged by Russia's incursion into Ukraine. No matter how much Russia may believe it is justified, I happen to agree with Russia in this case, it does run contrary to Westphalian principles. So China has been struggling with how to support Russia and yet maintain true to its core values. So this has been an ongoing struggle for China. This is one of the reasons why China has not come out and said, we support Russia's actions in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But neither has China supported the sanctioning of Russia. In fact, the opposite. China has encouraged the broadening of economic relations during a very difficult economic transition that Russia is making from the West and pivoting to the East. And China has been a major player in this. Without China's assistance, Russia would not be in the economic situation that it faces today. Do I believe that China is going to provide military assistance to Russia? One, I don't believe that Russia needs it. I'm not somebody who thinks that Russian defense industry is not capable of supporting Russia's war objectives. Russia is a nation that has been preparing for the potential of a conflict with NATO, not one nation, but the entire alliance, for decades now. And to insult Russia by saying they ran out of ammunition after 1 year of fighting Ukraine, I don't buy it. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But I don't buy it. I have more respect for Russian leadership and Russia's defense industries than to think that after 1 year they exhausted their ability to sustain combat against a NATO-style enemy, but it's only one country, not all of NATO. I know people are going to say, well, tens of billions of dollars of equipment have been thrown in there, but it's a fraction of the totality of NATO. Russia has been preparing for a conflict with NATO. So how could it run out of ammunition in 1 year against one NATO type member? Mm-hmm. Two, this is an artillery-driven war. Artillery is the weapon of choice. It's the most important weapon on the battlefield at this time. And that means that artillery ammunition is the fuel of this war engine. So if artillery ammunition is the fuel, why would you give China control of your fuel? Because if the goal is to be able to hit the accelerator when you want to create increase in combat potential on the battlefield at a time and place of your choosing, why would you give China the ability to put their foot on that accelerator? Because now what could happen, even though China says they are great friends with Russia, and I don't doubt them, China has its own national interests. And what happens if the United States comes and says, hey, we'd like to make a peace treaty about Taiwan? What's more important to China, Ukraine or Taiwan? This is a hypothetical. But now maybe China's foot doesn't go down when Russia wants it to go down. Maybe the foot stays off the pedal. The ammunition doesn't flow. Why would Russia ever allow that situation to happen? So I personally, again, because I respect Russian leadership and I understand how dedicated they are to the preservation of Russian sovereignty, why would they cede that sovereign control over their war, an existential conflict, to a foreign power, even one as close as China. So I don't think that this is a discussion about China providing that kind of military assistance. So why is China there? One, I think they're going to further their economic cooperation. I think we're going to see a furtherance of that. But China needs to overcome the self-imposed hurdles of the Westphalian principles when it comes to supporting Russia. There must be consistency. You know, for all that Russian people demand, rightfully so, that the world respect Russia's point of view, that the world respect Russian values, culture, and legitimate national security interests, then Russians must respect China's legitimate national security interests, values, culture, etc. And so China needs to be seen as pursuing a peaceful outcome to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There is a Chinese peace plan. They floated it already. Now, most people looked at it and went, nah, not adequate. But it wasn't meant to be adequate. It was a trial balloon. They floated it to get feedback, important feedback. Sometimes you put things out there that you know people are going to disagree with because you want to hear them disagree about it. You want them to commit to a line of thinking, a policy point, so that you have a basis now of negotiation. And what has been happening since China floated that trial balloon? There has been negotiation. That negotiation included the Chinese foreign minister coming to Moscow and meeting with Lavrov, Putin, and others. What did they talk about? We don't know exactly, do we? We know that Russian diplomats have been going to China and talking also. About what? We don't know. But what we do know is that leaders of the stature of Xi Jinping don't fly to Moscow not knowing exactly what they're going to be talking about with Vladimir Putin. So there is a peace plan on the table. And Russia has agreed in principle to this peace plan. We don't know what it is, but it's there. And Russia has to go through this process out of respect for China, because this is a global conflict being waged between the collective West, Russia, and China together. So Russia cannot ignore China, push China away. Russia must respect China's interests in this regard. Now, Russia will never be expected to do something that damages its national security. But what did Vladimir Putin say on February 21st of this year? He gave a speech, a very important speech. I happen to listen to his speeches. I think it's important that we listen to his speeches because he oftentimes gives us a hint of what he wants to do, what he wants to accomplish. And with all due respect to the Russian people who demand that Odessa be Russia, that Dnipropetrovsk be Russia, that Kharkov be Russia, Vladimir Putin did not say that at all. What he said is that Russia will secure the economic and social interests of Novorossiya, the Donbass. They will secure these territories, and they will improve the economic and social life of the citizens of Russia, As we speak, Odessa is not Russia. It is Ukraine. As we speak, Dnipropetrovsk is not Russia. It is Ukraine. As we speak, Kharkov is not Russia. It is Ukraine. Now, Putin did say that they would push Ukrainian forces beyond the borders of Russia to the maximum range of the longest range system provided by the West, which in this case is about 150 kilometers. If you do that, suddenly Odessa is Russia. Dnipropetrovsk is Russia. Kharkov is Russia, but it is not yet Russia. So why would he do this? Maybe there's a Chinese peace plan that offers Ukraine one last chance at survival. One last chance to surrender on terms that give them the ability to sustain themselves as a nation state. Push your military back 150 kilometers. Get rid of NATO equipment. Institute constitutional changes that allow Zelensky to remain in government, but outlaw the Nazi parties. No NATO ever. things of this nature. Now, you have to give China a chance to go to Ukraine. Now, they won't physically go there. I think there will be a video conference.
Yes.
Will Ukraine accept it? Probably not. Will the West accept it? Probably not. But China gave it a shot, a good shot, and Vladimir Putin agreed to it. But now what happens if China makes a good faith effort only to be rejected by Zelensky and the West? What's happening on the front line as we speak right now? Is Russia winning or losing? And I think the answer is Russia's winning. Russia is breaking the Ukrainian back, their defense. You're starting to see important breakthroughs in Bakhmut and other areas. As the Ukrainian lines are stretched thin, they don't have enough troops. There's talk about a Ukrainian counteroffensive, but there will be no counteroffensive. Ukraine is dying as we speak. Why is Xi Jinping here now? Because when Ukraine rejects the peace plan, the Russian army can be unleashed. And where do they go? Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov. And because Ukraine turned down the peace treaty, Russia will absorb Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov. But you can't get here to there without a process that respects China's own logic when it comes to foreign policy. In China, because they put forward a peace treaty that Russia supported, a peace effort that Russia supported, will be on Russia's side when the West rejects it. And that's important.
That's important. We will see very soon. My next question is quite short. You predict that the war will end by the end of summer or the beginning of autumn. You also referred to the words of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg that Ukraine will run out of ammunition. But this person is constantly lying. Why do you believe him now? Maybe he's lying and playing some kinds of game?
Maybe. But I don't think so. I think what we see with Jens Stoltenberg and other NATO officials now is a growing sense of desperation. They have gambled everything on this Ukrainian war and they're losing. So right now you see people starting to look for excuses. Why did they lose? Why didn't it go the way they wanted? You know, it's not just me who agrees with this. Xi Jinping, his elite military academy just came up with a study. You know what they said?
Yes,
War's going to end end of summer, early fall. Imagine that. Now, do you think they said that just because they read Scott Ritter's statement and went, Scott Ritter's obviously the smartest man in the world, therefore we're going to accept everything he says at face value? Or do you think perhaps China put their best military minds to the problem? And after considering all the data, which would be far more extensive than the data I have access to, they came to the proper conclusion that I happen to agree with, that Ukraine will not be able to continue this fight beyond summer, early fall of this year, that the war will be over, which is why Xi Jinping feels that he can go before Zelensky. See, when he goes before Zelensky, he isn't going to say, hey, Volodymyr, buddy, Scott Ritter thinks the war is going to end in the end of summer, early fall. So you got to surrender. But he can't look him in the eye and says, my best generals and their staffs have looked at this. You're going to lose at the end of summer, early fall. You're a dead man walking. Everybody around you is dead. Your country will be destroyed. I'm giving you one chance to live. So that gives him a little bit more power. So I'm confident with my assessments. I think Jens Stoltenberg in this case was telling the truth. You know, but it's not just Jens Stoltenberg. I mean, everybody's saying it. So unless NATO's suddenly decided that they're going to be in the con man game, where all they're going to do is play, you know, the big con, you know, try to fool Russia, because Russia is fooled so easily. You know, there's no serious people in Russia. The general staff is a joke. Your President Putin, obviously, his mind is elsewhere because Russia doesn't know the truth about ammunition supplies. Russian intelligence is incompetent. No, the Russians know what's going on. They know the game too. And so does NATO. NATO understands that they have run out of the ability to continue to support this war, this conflict in Ukraine.
Yes, we will see. The next topic I wanted to discuss is Georgia, protest in Georgia and Abkhazia. You have expressed your opinion several times, told about the story of your wife and her father. It found is a very big response on my channel. I wanted to tell you a little story. Your wife is Georgian from Sukhumi. My best friend is Lali Lobzhanidze. This girl who danced in Georgian dance at the end of all my videos in my channel. He has a Georgian surname, Lobzhanidze. But neither she nor even her dad have ever lived in Georgia. They are citizens of Russia. And so every year she and her mother fly from Moscow to Sochi, have a rest there and want to go to Abkhazia. And every time she and her mother are stopped at the border and no, not allowed them. The only reason is their Georgian surname. I don't understand the danger posed by 27-year-old girl and 60-year-old woman. I don't understand this. I think it's shame and it is bullying, absolutely bullying. I believe that this problem of Georgia and Abkhazia should be solved peacefully. In your opinion, it is possible in the near future?
In the near future, no.
Maybe.
Too much. There's too much bad blood in place. Look, let me make it quite clear. The Abkhazian people comprise 17% of the population of Abkhazia. So the notion that they get to dictate the future of the Abkhaz autonomous region is absurd in the extreme. Yes, they want a war. They want it with the assistance of Russia. They want it with the assistance of the Chechens. They want it with the assistance of the Caucasian mountain people. But they won. And to the victor goes the spoils. But where is Abkhazia today? Sukhumi, 50% population of what it was before. A city in ruins. Nobody's investing in Abkhazia. Nobody will invest in Abkhazia. It is part of Georgia. Now, the Georgians need to understand their role in the disaster that befell them. During Soviet times, the Abkhazians had their own language. They could study at their own universities, and they enjoyed a degree of autonomy that was unprecedented in many ways. But when Georgia became an independent state, Georgian nationalism reared its ugly head, and they started to oppress the Abkhazians. Now, we also have to keep in mind the role of people like Suslov, the former Soviet ideologist, who viewed Abkhazia and creating the concept of an independent Abkhazia as a means of suppressing Georgian nationalism. We have to understand the role of the KGB in creating these national movements to keep Georgian nationalism down. So when Georgian nationalism raises its head, these systems came into being. This wasn't purely an Abkhaz national revolt. This was a KGB plot to keep Georgian nationalism down. We know this. It was out of control too, because the KGB no longer existed. This happened at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed. So basically you had generals and former intelligence officers running around running their own war in Abkhazia, doing their own thing. 1 minute you have a Russian Air Force squadron flying out of a base near Sukhumi. The next minute it becomes an Abkhazian Air Force squadron. How did the Abkhazians suddenly get an Air Force? It was a Russian Air Force. How did they suddenly get artillery? It was Russian artillery. How did they suddenly get paratroopers? They're Russian paratroopers who swapped over and fought. This was an uncontrolled situation, and the Georgians, frankly speaking, behaved abysmally. when they sent in the Mechedrioni, the horsemen, who were a criminal gang, but they suddenly called themselves nationalists. They came in, they killed Abkhazian kids who were in the street. They brutalized the people. They pushed them out. They were as guilty of brutalizing the Abkhazians as the Abkhazians later were guilty of brutalizing the Georgians. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If the Georgians push, they will be pushed back. And this is what happened, a horrible tragedy. The majority of the Georgian people did not want this conflict, especially the people who lived in Sukhumi, who were brothers and neighbors, relatives of the Abkhaz. They had lived together peacefully for decades, and suddenly they're at each other's throats. The war is over. And I hope Georgia learned its lesson, that you cannot think of reunifying Abkhazia to Georgia through force of arms. The only way this is going to be done is through negotiations, and Georgia is going to have to concede a great deal of autonomy to Abkhazia. That's just the reality of it. But Georgia has a lot to offer. For instance, a lot of people don't know this, but the Abkhazian people who claim to hate Georgia, where do they go for their medical assistance? To Georgia. Why? Because the Georgian government views them as Georgian citizens and therefore says all Georgian citizens can get medical assistance. So the Abkhazians come to Tbilisi to get medical assistance in the capital city of the nation they claim to hate, which tells you that the hatred is superficial, that if there's a way to break through this hatred and to create a notion of cooperation, that this problem could be overcome, and they were working on overcoming it. Dmitry Medvedev was meeting with Saakashvili up until July of 2008, where they were discussing how to make this happen. But the United States stepped in and brought an end to that. We invited Georgia to join NATO. The Georgian people foolishly, like Adam reaching for the apple from Eve, took the forbidden fruit and then have been condemned ever since. They invaded South Ossetia. Now they can say, well, South Ossetia belongs to Georgia. Perhaps it does, but you can't violate agreements that had been in place for over a decade. You can't attack Russian peacekeepers. If you want South Ossetia to be brought back into Georgia, it has to be done through a process of negotiation that deals with the current realities, not what you wanted it to be 30 years ago. So, and today we have the some Georgians behaving abysmally. They want to open up a second front to draw Georgia into the Ukraine conflict, as if they haven't seen what happened to Ukraine and understand that is the future for Georgia. That is the future of Georgia if they get involved in a second front. Where do they think NATO assistance is going to come from? There is no long NATO border with Georgia. Where do they think European Union economic assistance is going to come from? There is no long European border. Georgia is isolated. Its only friend is Russia, but they don't realize that Russia is the only friend of Georgia, that Russia at the end of the day would work with Georgia to resolve these many problems if Georgia would only recognize Russia as its friend, not its enemy. And until which time Georgia renounces its desire to join NATO, because NATO is an organization openly hostile to Russia. You can't say, I want to be Russia's friend, but seek to join NATO at the same time. It makes no sense. Georgia has to make a choice, a decision. And right now they're going through that difficult process. The United States is, of course, doing what it always does. It holds up the dollar and it lures people in. With the promise of money. But this money doesn't lead to a better life. It leads to death and destruction, as all American efforts to lure you in with dollars do. America doesn't care about Georgia. America doesn't know Georgia. You say you have a Georgian friend. You say she dances Georgian dance. And I'm sure at some point in time, you guys have eaten Georgian food. But when she dances the kartuli, you probably know what the kartuli is, because you've seen it, because you're friends with Georgia, because Georgia because of your shared Soviet heritage, Georgia, and Russia are brother nations. Yes, you speak different languages. Yes, you have different cultures, but the Russian Federation is a landmass of differing peoples, differing cultures, differing religions. It's not a homogenous group of white Slavic Russians. There are many white Slavic Russians. I'm not saying they're the dominant race, but they don't sit there and treat everybody else as dirt. They say we are all Russia. We have a shared culture, a shared heritage. I don't know if Georgia could ever become part of that or even wants to become part of that. I think Russia respects Georgian sovereignty. But you have a shared history of friendship, of brotherhood, of kinship. America doesn't have that with Georgia. We don't. And we don't want Georgia to be Georgia. We want Georgia to be our servant. We want Georgia to do what we tell it to do when we tell it to do it. And this will only lead to further death and destruction of Georgia. So that's why I've spoken out, because I'm very concerned. And I take this personally. Look, I'm an American. So literally speaking, if I hadn't met my wife, I would be one of those ignorant Americans who didn't know what the Kartuli is, who didn't know what the military dances are, who doesn't know what Kinkali is or Khachapuri or what Joseph Stalin's favorite wine is. I would have been ignorant about Georgia as the day is long, but I married a Georgian woman. I've been to Sukhumi. I've seen how lovely it is, and I recognize it as a Georgian city in Abkhazia. I recognize that there are the complexity of the term Abkhazia. To Georgians, Abkhazia means something totally different than Apsua. Apsua, of course, are the Muslim, tribal elements who now call themselves Abkhazians, but they're part of the larger Circassian group. I've studied the history. I understand about the Russian conquest coming down and how the Circassians, including the Abkhazians, were exiled in large numbers to the Ottoman Empire. I've studied all of this. So I know Georgia. Georgia's may not be in my blood, but it's in my heart and it's in my brain. And I know how this has traumatized my wife's family. Her father and mother are buried here in Del Mar, New York. They belong in Georgia. They belong in Sukhumi. That was their home. That's where they married. That's where they had kids. That's where they raised their families. And that's where they should be buried, in their homeland, under the soil of their parents and their grandparents. But here they are in America, a foreign country, because they can't go home. My wife would like to be able to go home. Not because she wants to leave America, but she would like to visit her home, see her home. She would like to have her daughters be able to visit Sukhumi and see Sukhumi, but she can't right now. She used to believe that the best way to get Sukhumi was through military force. She used to believe that was the way, but she's changed her mind and you know what changed her mind? The war in Ukraine. She finally woke up to what America does, what American friendship means. American friendship only means the destruction of your country. And she is an American. She's an American citizen now. She's married to an American, a proud American. But she recognizes that America is not the friend of Georgia. Americans know nothing about Georgia, and they aren't willing to die for Georgia. So why would you get involved in a war that's being pushed on you by America when at the end of the day, no American's going to die for Georgia? The only people that are going to die are Georgians, and not for anything that Georgia wants, for what America wants. So she's had an epiphany, so to speak, and she now recognizes that Georgia must avoid the mistakes of Ukraine, that the way forward has to be through diplomacy, and it has to be out of a spirit of friendship with Russia. This will take time. This isn't going to happen overnight, but that's a trajectory that's far better than the current one, which only leads to more death and destruction.
I hope your wife will travel in Sukhumi in Abkhazia. This is a beautiful place. This is sea, mountain. This is beautiful place. Today is the anniversary, 20 years since the beginning of the US invasion of Iraq. I have two questions for you on this topic. First, do you remember that day and your thoughts when? And secondly, as far as I understand, 95% of Americans, maybe more, know that the war in Iraq was a lie, a deception. I don't want to say bad things about Americans. I'm sure they're good people, hardworking people, smart people, kind people who take care of their family, children, and another. But why? Knowing that the authorities, the deep state lied about Iraq and that time harmed millions of people, now they continue to believe, in fact, the same people. Of course, bad people can suddenly become good people, but this requires their repentance, recognition of mistakes. But there is no such things, absolutely.
No, you're right. Where was I on that? I was actually look. It's a very painful memory for me because I spent a lot of time trying to stop a war, and when I say trying to stop a war, I wasn't demonstrating in the streets. I was trying to stop a war. I was, taking the lead and trying to get Congress to hold hearings. I was in a personal war against Joe Biden. I was in a personal war against John Kerry, a personal war against Senator Lugar of Indiana. And I was putting pressure on them to hold hearings. And then when they held hearings, they kept me out of the hearings because they didn't want to hear what I had to say. So then I went to Iraq. I was threatened with arrest. I was threatened with I was called a traitor, committing treason. Why did I go to Iraq? To get weapons inspectors back into Iraq. Because at that time, the Bush administration was working with the British government to hype up weapons of mass destruction as a threat worthy of war. And their biggest argument was, we have no weapons inspectors in Iraq, so therefore Iraq is taking advantage in building all these weapons. And so I believe the best way to counter that would be to get weapons inspectors back in. But Iraq wasn't going to let weapons inspectors back in. So I, the most hated man in Iraq, they used to hate me like you wouldn't believe. They called me Abu Azamat, the father of all crises. When I showed up in Iraq, Saddam Hussein convened emergency meetings. There were assassination attempts against me. I was reviled, despised. And I decided that I had to go to Iraq. And to do what? To speak to the Iraqi parliament. No foreigner has ever addressed Iraq, the Iraqi parliament, let alone an American. Why did I need to do that? Because I had to get the attention of the Iraqi people. They had to believe me because they only knew me as Abu Azamat, the father of all crises. I had to introduce myself as Scott Ritter, the former weapons inspector who they had to trust. They had to learn to trust. So I went to Iraq and I spoke before the parliament and I won over the parliament. I won over the Iraqi people. And then I sat down with the Iraqi leadership at the highest levels and I won them over. And we got weapons inspectors back in. That was one of the biggest accomplishments of my life. And I felt really good about it. But then the inspectors got into Iraq and the United States government began playing the same games all over again, saying they're just not going to believe the work of the inspectors, that the Iraqis are hiding weapons. It doesn't matter. And then they even said, but if they get rid of it, it doesn't matter. Regime change is the only thing. So once again, I stepped up to the plate. I reached out to Saddam Hussein directly. I got him to agree to a 6-point peace plan. Listen what I'm saying. One person, me, little old Scott Ritter, reached out to Saddam Hussein and got him to agree to 6 principal points of peace. And then I got many peacemakers around the world to agree to this. And we were going to meet in Iraq and we were going to have the Iraqis publicly unveil that. Then the FBI decided that that wasn't going to happen. So they unleashed a vile attack against me. And of course, that plan didn't happen. I still didn't quit. I traveled to Japan to meet with the Japanese parliament to get them to oppose the conflict. I traveled to Europe to meet with European parliaments. I traveled to the Middle East to meet with the leaders of the Middle East. One man, Scott Ritter, nobody. Who am I? But I'm doing this because I believe we have to stop this war. Now, why did I believe this? Because I knew the war was a lie. For 7 years, I ran the intelligence programs of the United Nations, and I led the inspections in Iraq. There's a reason why they called me Abu Azamat, because I was the toughest inspector you ever met in your life. And when I went into Iraq, we did a good job. I knew the truth about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs, and I knew the case being put forward by my government was a lie. Therefore, as an American citizen who knows the truth, it's my job to get out there and tell as many people possible the truth. And I was working on that. I was coming home. I was in Detroit, Michigan, when the news broke that we had started bombing Iraq. It broke my heart, broke my spirit, broke my soul. You know, I can't say that I've fully recovered from that. I mean, some people ask why I'm out here, you know, doing what I'm doing not on behalf of Russia, because again, I wasn't doing this on behalf of Iraq. I was doing it on behalf of the American people. And so what I'm doing about the Ukraine-Russian conflict isn't on behalf of the Russian people. I'm glad many people in Russia like me, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for my people, for the American people. I'm doing this to keep us from making a mistake, a horrible mistake. I personally believe that good relations with Russians and Americans is good for America. Not just good for Russia, it's good for America. But why would I do this again? Especially when my spirit was crushed. And I don't know, because maybe my spirit will get crushed again. You know, and I'm 60 years old now, right now, and I don't know how much more of this I can take, but I'm going to do it. But that was a tough thing for me, that war. And one of the things that makes it hurt is that even when years later, people began to recognize that I told the truth. I don't think there's anybody out there right now that says, well, Scott Ritter lied. They used to say that all the time, just like they say it today about when I speak about Russia. You're a liar. You're a liar. Vladimir Putin's bought you. You're getting Russian money. You have a book being published in Russia. My God, you're a horrible man. But they said that about me, about Iraq. A lot of people don't know that because of the stance I took on Iraq, I was charged with treason by my government. And by the most powerful prosecutors in America, Mary Jo White of the Southern District of New York, who never loses a case. David Kelly, the FBI's counterterrorism guy, coming after me. These guys never lost a case in their life, and they're coming after me, and the penalty for treason is death. We're not joking here. They're going to kill me. But I fought them, and I won. But it takes a horrible toll. Imagine that. One man fighting the United States government. One man fighting the media who turned on me. I used to be the darling of the media. I could go on every program, but then my message became inconvenient because it was never about the truth. It was about telling what they wanted to hear, not what they needed to hear. So the media turned on me, and I was attacked, derided, spit on, isolated. I couldn't get a job, unemployed, unemployable. But I told the truth, and people recognized I told the truth today. But what about the people that lied? What about George W. Bush? You know, to say about the American people, they're as guilty as anybody else about respecting authority. For instance, there's a gentleman named Richard Haas. Richard Haas used to be in the State Department policy planning. During the lead up to the Iraq War, he was, in fact, I think that's what his job was, director of policy planning. He knew that it was a lie. Now, today he says he doesn't. Today he says it was a mistake. We made a mistake. We didn't intend to lie. It was a mistake. But see, that's a lie. Now, how do I know it's a lie? Because I briefed the State Department. I briefed the White House. I briefed the Pentagon on the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The truth that now everybody recognized I was right. I was telling the truth. I wasn't making it up. I wasn't guessing. It's not like today where I'm doing analysis of Russia. I freely admit that I don't know hardly any of the real facts out there, that I'm like everybody else trying to, work my way through conflicting information. But with Iraq, I knew everything because I did it for 7 years. And so when Richard Haas says we didn't know, he's a liar. He knew. Why? I told him. When the White House says, we didn't know, you knew. Why? I told you. When Joe Biden says, I didn't know, he's lying. I told him to his face in his office. They all lied. But here's the difference. Today, when they speak, Joe Biden is the president of the United States. Richard Haas is up there with the Council for Foreign Relations. George W. Bush is an esteemed former president in residence at home. They all have these great jobs. They work for Harvard. They work for Stanford. They work for Hoover Institute. They work for everybody. Scott Ritter apparently works for Vladimir Putin. So, I mean, so when it comes time for people, when they wake up in the morning, first of all, you don't have to work very hard to hear the official position. You turn on TV, it's there. You open up the newspaper, it's there. To hear me, you have to work. You have to actually get on the line, and you have to Google it, but you have to get through all the blocks from Twitter, the suppression from YouTube, Facebook suppression, and dig in deep and get through what other people are saying about me, push that away to get to what I say. And then you're left with a choice. Do I believe this, or do I believe the entire establishment that's talking to me? And for the average American, it's an easy decision. You believe the establishment because that's the authority. So you can condemn the American people all you want. But I would say that Russian people are the same way. That if given the choice to believe the establishment or one dissenting voice, human nature says we're going to believe the establishment. And that's where we are today. And it's a travesty because in this case, there's no question that everybody recognizes that there were no weapons of mass destruction. That's hard. That's not even a debate today. There's some fringe element out there say, oh yeah, he had him. He sent him to Syria. He did this, he did that. Most people said, nope, they were gone. But then they say, but there was no ill intent on the part of the Bush administration. It was a mistake. It was an error. And we are all human. We all make mistakes. It's forgive them. I will never forgive them because I know it wasn't a mistake. I know it was a lie.
Do you have more time?
Sure.
My next question is related to the Russian army. As you know, it has been decided to increase its strength from 900,000 people to 1,500,000 soldiers. I believe it seems to me that you will agree with me here that if there is war with NATO in the future, it will turn into a nuclear war in the very short time. And I don't understand why spend money on increasing the number of soldiers in the army when it is clear that there will be exchange of nuclear missiles in the war with NATO. In my opinion, this is money, the money of Russian taxpayers could have been spent in a more reasonable way. Do you agree with the opinion that spending on the army should be reduced, not increased? And do you understand the decision of Russian leadership?
Let's start off with some just basic facts about NATO. One, it's an alliance in decline. It's not an alliance that's getting stronger every day. It's an alliance getting weaker every day. Yes, I know Finland may join. Sweden, who knows what's going to happen to Sweden? But what's going to happen to Turkey? What's going to happen to Hungary? It's a NATO, it's an alliance in crisis. So now you're a Russian strategic leader and you're looking at NATO and you're saying, is this a homogeneous, strong element that if we ever go to war, it's inevitable that we go to nuclear? Or is this an alliance that's collapsing and we have to be prepared to deal with the chaos that comes from that collapse? And if it's the chaos that comes from that collapse, now we come down to the fundamentals of NATO. NATO can rally around each other under one of two ways. The first, of course, is the well-known Article 5. An attack against one is an attack against all, except it's not. Read Article 5. It doesn't say that all of NATO automatically goes to war. It says that NATO members are obligated to consider an attack against one as an attack against all, and then decide what they want to do about it, whether they want to get involved, and if that involvement will be military. There's nothing automatic about it at all. So when you're dealing with an alliance that's fracturing, collapsing, falling apart, there's a good chance that if there's a unprovoked or if there's a rogue crisis, for instance, between Finland and Russia or Poland and Russia, where the Finns and the Poles are to blame, Romania and Russia, where the Romanians are to blame, that many, if not most, of NATO members will say, we don't want to be part of this conflict. So now NATO's not involved. Mm-hmm. But now if Russia doesn't have a military, Russia could lose. Russia has to have a conventional military capable of defeating NATO in a conventional fight, because that will help preserve Russia's national security as NATO begins to break down. Now, at some point in time, Russia can reduce its military. Mm-hmm. But you know what's easier to do than build a military? Reduce a military. It's the easiest thing to do. It's very hard to build a military. And you can't wait until there's an emergency to say, I need a bigger military. Russian leadership's looking at the reality of Europe and mm-hmm. recognizing that there could be a conflict with Finland. There could be a conflict with Romania. There could be a conflict with Poland that doesn't involve NATO. And then if Russia doesn't have the forces able to handle that, if Russia's still, for instance, in a major conflict with Ukraine, when Finland decides to get stupid, mm-hmm. how will Russia respond? Well, they have to build a force there, which is what they're doing. This is an absolute, in my opinion, an absolute necessity, an absolute requirement for Russian national security to do this. And as I said, at some point in time, as the situation devolves and then transforms into, hopefully, a negotiation with Europe over a new European security framework that brings, this core of stability into Europe, they won't need those many troops. And then Russia can once again begin the process of disarming. This time I think they might choose to disarm in a more, I won't say intelligent, because that's insulting people, mm-hmm. but in a way that could lead to rapid mobilization if necessary, so that you have reserves who are trained, who can be rapidly mobilized and brought back into active duty, so you don't have to go through this 300,000 man mobilization that taught Russia a lot, but it was very sloppy and very inefficient and very unwieldy. That only worked against Ukraine, but if you tried to do 300,000 against an active NATO conflict, you would have had a lot more problems. So who knows what Russia is going to do down the future? But the basic premise of your question, I believe that the Russians are behaving in a very measured and responsible fashion in building up the military they need to deal mm-hmm. with the instability that the world is challenging them with. Remember, there's something going on in the Pacific too, Japan mm-hmm. being pushed by the United States. What happens if there's a Korean conflict? Can Russia guarantee that Russia doesn't get dragged into that conflict? How many forces does Russia have in the Far East? Are they capable of being there? Does Russia need to build them up? The United States is talking about the Arctic. Does Russia have sufficient forces to fight a war in Ukraine and hold the United States back in the Arctic and the Kola Peninsula and Belarus? Suddenly that 1.5 million may not be enough. Yes, we don't know.
We'll see. I have recently been interested in the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. As far I understand, this is issue very relevant in the USA. I also heard George Galloway's magnificent speech at Oxford in February about how ordinary British soldiers, nicknamed Tommy Atkins, suffer after participating in the war. Alcohol, drugs, domestic violence, abuse, and other problems. I believe that the Soviet Union and then Russia, Afghanistan, and Chechnya did not cope well with post-traumatic stress disorder in soldiers and socialization. For example, my father served in Afghanistan 2 years, and when he returned home, he resolved absolutely nothing from the state country. He still doesn't believe in the government because he thinks he is betrayed. He also had problems with alcohol. And now I believe that there will be many soldiers in Russia, even when we win this war, who will return with various injuries, psychological and physical problems. For sure that there's some government assistance programs, I don't know for sure, but I wonder not the state, not the government, but we, a society of people. I'm reading a book now, The Tribe by Sebastian Jonga. Maybe you read it too. And he writes about the importance of society, of people, the tribe in helping such people. What do you think we, as not government, as a society of people, can do for such soldiers, veterans? How can we help them forget the horrors of war, what we have done and seen in this war?
That's it's a very good question. Let's take a look at the Great Patriotic War, what we call the Second World War. Mm-hmm. No nation suffered the trauma that the Soviet Union suffered. I mean, it's a statement of fact. Were your soldiers traumatized in the conflict? Yes. Mm-hmm. Did they see things that men should never see? Yes. Did they do things that men should never be asked to do? Yes. And when a human being, because I believe that, contrary to propaganda in the West, that the average Russian boy growing up in the 1930s was not raised to hate, was not raised to kill, but was raised, to be a productive member of society. I'm not naive to believe that Soviet society was perfect. I mean, there was a lot of trauma already in Soviet society because of the repressions of 1936, going beyond that, starvation, forced collectivization, industrialization, etc. So, but generally speaking, the average person who was of military age during the Great Patriotic War was not raised to be a killer. So when they were thrown into a situation where they had to kill or be killed, and they saw people killed, it is psychologically damaging. We can't pretend otherwise. You're not human if it's not. If you're a human being who's been exposed to something like that and it doesn't trouble you, then there's a problem with you. Mm-hmm. But Soviet society was also traumatized. Leningrad, Stalingrad, all of the cities of Ukraine and Belarus were traumatized. Even going back, the experience of receiving Vodkinsk, where I worked. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've studied the history of how they received the factory from Kiev, and they received the anti-aircraft factory, and they brought it in, they put the factory in place, and then they received the workers, and the workers lived in barracks with poor heating, etc. And the stress that placed on the town, the city as a whole. All of that was repeated throughout the Soviet Union as they absorbed the industries and rebuilt the industries, and they invested themselves in the conflict. It was very rare to say that, to have a Russian family say, my family wasn't impacted by the war at all. Everybody was impacted by the war. So when the Russian veteran came home, he also was returning to a traumatized society, a society that had been torn asunder, had seen things that shouldn't be seen, done things that shouldn't have had to been done, etc. And so the society healed together. I think that they bonded and they healed together. Am I going to say that there was no alcoholism amongst returning Soviet soldiers? Of course not. Of course there was alcoholism. Alcohol is the weakness of all men when they are confronted with depression and things of that nature. You escape to the bottle. It's what people do regardless of race. But they also had the society to say, don't work with us. Let's recover. Let's move forward. And so, I don't know the statistics. I can't claim that I've seen the statistics, but my guess is that Russia, the Soviet Union, recovered from the trauma of the Great Patriotic War collectively. And that is, this community helped each other as they struggled with what it meant to survive such a conflict and try and grow, move on past that. The United States, we sent 12 million men off to fight. Over 300,000 of them didn't come home. A larger number were wounded. And those that came home, many of them saw things that shouldn't be seen and did things that should never be done. But now they came to a society that wasn't traumatized by the war. It was inconvenienced by the war. The war was an inconvenience. We gave up our rubber tires. We gave up our steel pots. We tightened our belts. We had rationing, but it was an inconvenience. People still went out at night and partied and danced, and there was frivolity and all this kind of stuff. And there was a large segment of American male population that did not fight, nor did they want to fight. They stayed home. They made money. They got wealthy. And then the soldiers come home, and yes, we tried to make it comfortable for them with the GI Bill so they could go to college. But, there's a series in the United States, The War in the Pacific, they call it. It was based upon the writings of several authors. It's true stories of several Marine veterans. Mm-hmm. And the one Marine who came home, he went to college. He got the GI Bill, so he was going to go to college. And he's there, and the girl, beautiful little co-ed girl behind the table, college girl. And she's like, so what do you have to offer? He said, well, I was in the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, what are you good at? I mean, can you do this? Can you do that? And he's like, no. She goes, oh, and he goes, I'm pretty good at killing Japs. And she's like, oh, didn't understand it. The society didn't get it. In Russia, I don't think a single Russian woman would have asked the guy about this because she knew, she didn't, it was assumed. But in America, the guys that came home, we didn't want to know about them. And so they had to bottle it up. And you talk about the 1950s, an entire generation of American men who were World War II veterans who were supposed to be heroes. We won the war. We defeated Imperial Japan. We defeated Nazi Germany. But their only outlet was what? Parades. So you can have a parade. Yay, here come the heroes in their uniforms. Nice parade. And they hold a dinner for you. But then you go home and you have your nightmares. And you get drunk and you beat your wife and you yell at your children. But they don't want to know about that. So nobody wants to know about that. We ignored it. We pretended it didn't happen. It was inconvenient. And this is for a war we won. Now let's go to Korea, where we didn't win. Let's go to Vietnam, where we lost. Entire generations. And America is this hyper-patriotic country that says we support our troops. We support the troops, but we don't support the troops. We support the concept of the troops. We like men in uniform. They look good. I look good in uniform. It's hard to believe. And everybody's like, ooh, you look good. But they never want to hear about what you're training to do. So how's the Marine Corps? Well, I get up and I go to the field for, 28 days straight, learn how to kill commies. Oh, and how's the weather? They just don't want to talk about it. They want to say, well, how do you kill commies? Well, we're in a maneuver warfare. You see, I'm trying to target, kill, boom, boom, boom. They don't want to hear about that. That's too inconvenient. But we support our troops, but we don't want to know about what they're getting ready to do because that's disturbing. Of course, it's disturbing. It's about war. And then God forbid they go out and do it and they go to war. Now you really don't want to know about it. I mean, there's the old saying, how many times I've heard this? You're in the bar, you're drinking. You kill anybody? Not today, but I'm still young. I could kill you if you ask that question again. The stupidity of that question. Did you kill anybody? But then they don't want to know. Because what if, God forbid, I turn to them and say, yeah, you see, there was this, and I didn't do this, but there was this family that was coming down the road, but I mistook the car and we fired in and I hit a 10-year-old girl right in her head and I blew the head apart and her mother was bleeding out on the 6-month-old baby who choked to death on the blood coming from the brain. Do they want to hear that? Nobody wants to hear that. But that's the answer. That's the answer. Or, yeah, we were assaulting a position and there was a young Taliban kid down there who was bleeding out and gurgling on his blood. And I was getting ready to maybe give first aid, but another guy fired at me. So I just turned and emptied a magazine into him just to make sure he was dead. Do you want to hear that? You want to hear about how he killed the Taliban? Do you want to hear about all the death that happened? Nobody wants to hear about that, but they pretend they want to because they think it's glorious. They think it's like a Hollywood movie. Did you kill anybody? Were you like John Wayne? Were you like, other great war heroes? Well, there's nothing glamorous about killing people or watching your friends get killed. The guy that stepped on the landmine, bam, bleeding out there, but you can't get to him because there's other mines. So you're trying to work your way in there. He's screaming for help. You're throwing him the first aid kit, but he can't get it because his arm's blown off too. And he bleeds out while you're about 15 feet away from him. Do they want to hear about that? Nobody wants to hear about that. So then what happens? You come home and society claims to be your friend. They supported you in going in. I mean, high schools held parties for you. They were cheering for you as you went off to war. But when you came home for war, they shook your hand, they asked you stupid questions, and then they walked away from you because they didn't want to know the truth. They didn't want to know what war really is. So these guys end up drinking themselves to death. They end up doing drugs. And the other thing about war is it hurts. It hurts. And I'm not just talking about mentally, physically. Your knees get bad. I can barely walk. Backs are awful, man. My back, my body is a wreck because of my military service. But they don't want to hear about that. They don't want to hear about the fact that when you wake up in the morning, you're almost crying and puking because of the pain just to get out of bed. But now when you go and ask for, I don't do any drugs. I made a decision I will never do a drug in my life. But there's guys who have to just to cope. So they go and they get the medicine from the VA, and so the VA gives them the painkillers. They're taking the painkillers, and then the VA says, well, you don't need the painkillers anymore, and they take them right off the painkillers. But now the guys are addicted to the painkillers, and they're still hurting. Where do they go? Well, they go to the street, and you can't get the real drugs. So heroin is a very good painkiller. So these guys who are hooked on OxyContin now start shooting up heroin. They become addicted to heroin. And then we look at him and say, oh, you're a loser. You're a drug addict. You're a loser. No, he was a hero. He was a hero, but he was broken. And we didn't take care of him. Now he's a drug addict. Or the guys that just saw so much, killed kids. Imagine being a father and you were involved in a situation where you killed a wife and the kids. Now you come home and you see your wife and your kids. And yet when you look at them, it's the faces. So you start drinking, and next thing you know, you're an alcoholic. You're a loser. Society rejects you, but you were a hero. You were. Society has to be a shared experience, or else the soldiers, the sailors, the Marines, the airmen, they get pushed aside. And, what's happening with now in the global war on terror is it's not a shared experience. Nobody who lived in the United States shared that. There were parties every night. Restaurants were open, TV, entertainment, life did not change, but we sent these people off to do things over there that we didn't want to know about. And they come home broken. And I will tell you, everybody that returns from war is broken. I'm going to say this to the Russian people right now. Every man you sent to the special military operation is going to come home broken because war fundamentally changes people. Fundamentally changes them. They will never be the same, ever. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to receive them? Because if you're not sharing their experience, and this experience can't just be shared with the families, because the families do share. When I went to war, my family shared. We communicated. They understood. When other guys go to war, their family. But when you come home, is it just the family? But now you're inconvenient to the family too, because remember, they even though they wrote with you, they were living their life. If Russian society isn't sharing this experience, living this experience, breathing this experience, feeling this experience, and in many ways being broken by this experience, hurting by this experience, then you can't receive these soldiers properly. It has to be a shared experience, so that when they come home, family is there for them society is there for them. And I think Russia will do a good job. I have confidence that you know how to treat your veterans better than we do. We abandon our veterans. Everybody puts these yellow stickers on their car, support the troops. But when was the last time they went to the VA hospital to visit the guy who, was getting his colostomy bag changed out, getting fitted for his prosthesis, or who's just sitting there shaking because he's an alcoholic and nobody loves him anymore. The whole world abandoned him. He's now stuck in a room alone, shaking, nobody to talk to. Is this what Russia is going to do to its veterans? Maybe. Did you do that to some Afghan veterans? Yeah. Do it to some Chechen veterans? Yeah. I bet you if Syria had gone long enough, you'd have done it to the Syrian veterans too, because you didn't share the experience. You have no excuse right now. This is a shared experience, what's happening. Special military operation. All of Russia needs to share this, because if not, you're going to pay a heavy price. You're going to pay a heavy price in the decades to come. You may win this war, but you're going to lose. You may win the war on the front, but you're going to lose the war on the home front when you receive all these soldiers who are broken. Every single one of them will be broken. They'll have seen things. They'll have done things. And if society isn't ready to deal with those consequences, you ask them to do this. Now they did it. If you turn your back on them and aren't willing to accept the consequences of what you ask them to do, then there will be PTSD. And that means that there will be alcoholism. There will be drug abuse. There will be beaten wives, abused children, because that's what happens when you break. They don't plug into society and behave normally. They behave abnormally. So.
Thank you. My last question is your book Tour to Russia. I heard that you will be in Russia for 25 days in May, and you have a list of 25 towns. I released the short videos where people asked you if you would be in Vladivostok, when in Nizhny Novgorod, but there were no more details. And all the people in the comments writing, will Scott Ritter come to Kaliningrad? Scott Ritter coming is Orenburg. Scott Ritter coming to Volgograd and another towns. Please tell us a little more about your tour. What towns are, what dates, what are you planning? We are very, very interested, and I guarantee to you there will be full halls everywhere in the all towns.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I'm hesitant. There it is, but it'll be in Russian. I was told that a publisher, Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is a very good publisher, was going to publish the book. And from what I understand, they still are. But the reason why I stopped talking about it is because I don't have a contract. Meaning, I heard that they want to, but they can't publish the book until they and my American publisher reach an agreement. And there's no agreement right now. So I'm not saying there won't be an agreement. I'm just saying there isn't one. So I'm sort of like, well, maybe I shouldn't get too far ahead until there's an agreement. I thought the agreement would be done by now, but it's not. But that's okay. Things take time. The list of cities is very ambitious. But again, until it's finalized, because I don't know if the organizers were just overly enthusiastic and they put out cities, and then the reality of what they've put out there is hitting home, and they're going, we can't do all that. We're going to have to, pare it down. I don't know. So I can't sit here and tell you with absolute certainty that I'm going to be anywhere other than Moscow. If the contract is signed, I know that I'm supposed to fly to Moscow and we'll start something there. Where would we go? That's again up to the organizers, and I don't want to, say that I'm going to be here only to have it not happen. But I mean, where would I like to go? Everywhere. I know that's impossible, but I would like to go to St. Petersburg. If I do this, my daughters are coming with me, and I want to be able to show my daughters Russia. I want to go to Votkhinsk, and I want to spend some time in Votkhinsk. I want to show my daughters where I worked, where I lived, where I met their mother. you know, and let them experience that. How many fathers get a chance to do that with their daughters? Would I like to go to Vladivostok? Yes. Would I like to go to Irkutsk? I would love to go to Irkutsk. Would I like to go to Ekaterinburg? Yes. Would I like to go to Kazan? Yes. Sochi? Yes. Novosibirsk? Yes. Kaliningrad? Yeah, that would be fascinating to go to Kaliningrad. Am I going to go to these cities or others? I don't know. I don't know because I'm not in control of the tour. But if it happens, my understanding is that they would like the book launch to take place on May 9th, which is a very big day for Russia, Victory Day, and then proceed from there. And I will gladly participate in whatever tour is offered. I think it's a unique opportunity to, you know, meet the Russian people, to talk with them about, you know, arms control and my experiences as a weapons inspector, to show my daughters Russia. But to sit here and say I can guarantee that this is going to happen, I can't do that right now, which is why I sort of stopped talking about it, because until I have it in writing, you know, guarantee it's going to happen, why would I, you know, tell people, yes, this is going to happen absolutely this way. But I will say this, any Russian city that I have the privilege of going to, it will be an honor. And any Russian city that I'm unable to go to, I will put that down, and hopefully in the future there might be other books where I can go, you know, or I can return, you know, when things calm down, I can return as a tourist and do that. You know, it's not a slight. If we don't go to a city, it's not a slight. It doesn't mean that people deemed you unworthy or that I don't want to go there. I want to go to every town, village, in city in Russia. I am in love with Russia and the Russian culture, the Russian people, the Russian nation. I want to share that with my daughters. If I could spend, you know, eternity exploring Russia, that would be wonderful. But we're limited by reality, by time, by the clock, by money, by budgets. So we'll see what the future has in store for us all.
Do you practice Russian language? Thanks.
I've been too busy, but I'm more. my wife does challenge me on occasion, but then she cringes when I speak Russian, and so she says it's probably best if I have an interpreter.
She cried.
Cringes.
Of course.
It's horrible.
Anyway, welcome to Russia, and thank you so much. Your work, your interview, it's unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And it's he is hero, and in this situation with Iraq 20 years ago, and today with this situation. Thank you so much, Mr. Ritter.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Have a good week.